I don't think we talk enough about what deeper learning means and how that translates. We don't talk enough about the K-12 school to college to career pipeline of technology. We talk about coding in a sense, but we only talk about as much as we are comfortable talking about. So let's talk robots and doing some block coding and keep it moving. But we don't talk about how that translates into understanding what computer science or computing means, or
That there is
understanding
the
just some
author
of the
of The
networks that
Missing
we
Voices in
use. Like
Edtech,
right
Bringing
now, every
Diversity
time it seems
into
like I
Edtech,
blog on Twitter,
Rafranz
something
Davis. Rafranz is an instructional technologist and national speaker that uses her voice to challenge those in education communities on topics of equity and diversity in edtech and education.
In this episode, we speak with Rafranz on what experiences she's had that have shaped her beliefs and values on education. She shares what she thinks diversity is and what it is not, how we should teach students first and foremost, and how we educators can learn a thing or two from boy bands. Let's first play that intro music. Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm Kyle Pierce from tapintoteenminds.com.
And I'm John Orr from mrorr-isageek.com. We are two math teachers who, together,
with you, the community of educators worldwide who want to build and deliver math lessons that spark engagement,
fuel learning,
and ignite teacher action. Let's get ready to dive into another episode. How are you feeling today, John?
Awesome. We are honored to have spoken with Rafranz and appreciate that you, the one listening to this right now, have taken the time in your day to listen in. Before we get to our discussion with Rafranz, we want to let you know that if you're listening to this before September 27th, 2019, then you are cutting it pretty close to joining us for our 16-week full online workshop.
Yes, that's right. Our online workshop is designed to walk you through step-by-step to help you teach through real-world problems and create those resilient problem solvers you're after. If you're interested in learning more about registering, be sure to check out makemathmoments.com/online workshop. If you're listening after the fall 2019 registration close date, you can still head to makemathmoments.com/online workshop to join the waiting list in order to get notified for your next opportunity to participate.
That's makemathmoments.com/online workshop.
Without further ado, here is our chat with Rafranz.
Hey there, Rafranz. Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are so excited to have you on the show today. How are you doing this lovely evening?
I am super excited to be here.
Oh, absolutely. We've actually had our eye on inviting you on for quite some time. I know you and I both go back quite a ways from the Twitter world, and we've sort of bumped into each other along the way at some Edtech conferences a number of years ago, but it's been a while since we bumped into each other. But how about for those at home? I'm wondering, do you mind letting our listeners understand a little bit more about who Rafranz Davis is? Can you fill us in on your role, where you're located, and maybe a little bit of your teaching backstory?
Sure. So I have been an educator for almost 20 years. If you actually consider all of my pre-service time when I was a working pre-service teacher, which is an interesting thing that we don't honor enough. And I taught math from second grade all the way up to seniors in high school in the span of about 2.5 years. It's a hilarious story how that all took place.
Wow. Yes.
It's pretty funny. But yeah.
You just one month in each classroom?
No. So I started my pre-service time. I was actually hired as a math assistant, and my job was literally to teach a class. I taught actually first, second, and third grade, 30-minute math sessions all day. I had maybe 5 to 6 students each math session. I mean, that was before I was actually certified to teach. And then once I started my internship, then I moved up to 6th grade, and then I took on 5th grade remediation at the same time. And then I was hired that same December to teach 8th grade. And then I taught 8th grade for like that year and a half. And then I had a student that clearly needed my guidance, or he would not have graduated high school, and that is the truth. So I took the test to teach high school, passed it, and was hired the following year to teach geometry at high school. And then I taught geometry, Algebra 1, and Algebra 2 the year after that.
Wow, that is quite the ride.
Right. It's like you followed that student into high school. That's pretty awesome.
I didn't have a choice. I mean, he was not going to graduate if I didn't. We both recognized that that was going to be the case just because of the things that he was facing in our community. It just wasn't going to happen. But yeah, that was kind of the gist of my math education career. And then I transitioned from there to instructional technology, spent actually a year in a larger school district as a math strategist, following year as an instructional technologist for like a year and a half. And then I took on my latest role as an executive director of professional and digital learning for a school in East Texas. And I actually just left that school district. And now I'm in a brand new transition to be doing some new and interesting things as far as STEAM and working with low access schools.
Oh, interesting. And now, is that through a specific district or the same district, or is that through a different district or maybe some other type of organization?
Yeah, it's with a new organization. It's actually not completely live yet. So I don't want to say too much.
Suspense.
Yeah, it is. Basically, my role will be to take the opportunities and programs that I created in my last school district and spread that so that other schools can have access to those same materials and resources.
One of the questions we ask every guest we have is this one question, which relates to our title of the podcast. Could you fill us in on what's a memorable math moment from math class when you think back to you as a student going through the education system, and maybe, it could be from any grade at any level. When we say math class, there's something that, when I think of math class, there's something that pops in my brain as soon as I say it, and it just always has stuck with me. What would be your memorable math moment from math class?
Probably the most memorable one was kind of when I realized that I was smarter than I thought and probably knew a great deal more than most people around me, including my teacher. That's sort of the way it was. I mean, when I was a student in school, my mother used to actually take me to tutor our high school students in our church that were struggling to pass our state assessments. I was in probably 6th grade, and she would yank me up to go to church and tutor. So I kind of have always have had that kind of close relationship with math, is what I kind of like to call it. But I did have a moment in class when I realized that I was kind of dumbing myself down because I didn't want the ridicule from the students around me. And I also didn't really want to say anything that would make my teacher feel bad because she was awfully wrong a lot. But that probably is what stuck out to me more than anything, was just sitting there knowing that you know something, but not feeling confident or comfortable enough to say it. And that probably is what I think about most often.
I'm curious, when you say that the teacher was often wrong, are you referencing mostly around the idea of solutions, or maybe even, do you feel even about maybe the mindset of the teacher in terms of what makes a good math student? Do you mind elaborating on that?
Sure. So one of the big issues that I felt like, I probably had maybe 2 great math teachers in school, one in middle school, one in high school. The problem with that position often, from what I encountered, actually 3, I take that back. My trigonometry teacher was amazing. But the problem that I had was, I don't know if any other students face this. So in Texas, football coaching is makes the decision for everything in school. So when a coach is hired and they need a position for his wife, they would often find various positions in school to give that wife a job.
Did you say wife?
And I hate to say this, but it happened.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
I'm not kidding. It actually happened. And I worked with one too. So, I know full well in this particular school district how it went. So this particular teacher that we had, she didn't even have a math degree, had not ever studied math. I think her degree was in PE. I felt bad for her because on one part, after teaching, I realized, she's got to do a lot of studying to be able to teach this. But as a student, it was frustrating because I wanted to learn a little bit. It was Algebra 1. I wanted to learn a little bit more. I wanted to go beyond the book. I wanted to do more complex problems, but she didn't really understand how to explain anything. So I would, even as a student who knows, the hard part is you kind of have to blank yourself out in that moment just so that you don't. I wanted to be respectful of her. But at the same time, I also didn't want my peers to make fun of me. So you're dealing with that, which is a pretty significant thing to deal with as a teenager. But then the other part of it was I had to do a lot of kind of self-study myself back then because I didn't learn a thing in that classroom.
That's really interesting. And, I know in the US, we're in Ontario where athletics is important in schools. And sometimes I feel like teachers here, like it's all volunteers who coach the sports and do the after school clubs
Oh,
and all of
no,
those
that
things.
is not the case.
Yeah.
Texas, it
It's
is a
huge. I know. And when you said that and you told us that that actually has happened and maybe, dare I say, might happen more often than one might hope, I often get a little bit upset when I feel sometimes a teacher can sort of get off the hook on teaching practice if they're coaching certain sports or if they're coaching a lot of sports. I feel like they sort of don't get, nudged to try to continue improving instructional practice. It's just sort of like, I don't want to potentially lose the coach of the whatever team, which I think is an issue. But then when you describe that scenario, that is just so much on the other end of the spectrum, like way over the line. I would really have a hard time with that.
I'm sure it happens a lot less now, especially in Algebra 1, because it is a core tested course. And plus, the state does require for schools to have highly certified teachers into those positions. So it's a lot harder to do that now. The only way they can do that now is if the teacher's grandfathered in. And I have not seen very many schools that are willing to do that. But when I was a student, it absolutely happened. I felt awful for her. But at the same time, that was kind of the moment when I realized that sometimes I just needed to hold it in. And I didn't need for her to feel any type of way about me calling attention to something that she had done. I also didn't want to bring an additional amount of attention on myself from my peers. Those are hard times as a kid when you're sitting in class with your big Coke bottle glasses on and all the awkwardness of being 14, 15 years old in a math class that other kids already do not want to be in. And then be the one to say, oh, that's not exactly how that works. Whenever you multiply two monomials, you actually need to add the exponents. I mean, like little things like that. Or no, that's not how order of operations works. Or, it's just really interesting, basic things. But that is the moment that sticks out to me more than anything.
And I'm wondering as well, so you went back and you told us a story of following a particular student into high school and essentially helping to support him reach his goal of graduating. I'm wondering, do you have any other examples from when you were in the math classroom specifically, some things where you were able to find some success? We'll definitely talk about some challenges as well, because, in a math classroom, there's always challenges. But I'm wondering if you have any other examples of where you've come across some successes in your classroom. And then we'll kind of move on and discuss maybe some of the challenges that we've faced along the way as well.
Sure. I mean, you said in any other situation, and I could talk on and on about that particular student, but I mean, his challenges just a lot of it were from how he was treated in other classrooms and being kicked out of classrooms and no one really caring for him in school, and me having to step in and be that person that actually cares for him. So that to me is, I think, worth a great deal of conversation in just where that takes place and how, which I'm sure we can touch on later. But and the other situations that really stuck out to me were one of my Algebra 1 classes. I'll never forget it. The class was fourth period. It was right after lunch. And I had 32 freshmen in one class with 28 desks. So there's a challenge. But the other part of that challenge was we also had a pretty high immigrant student population. We had students that came in almost weekly from Mexico. And the counselors would come in and tell me, hey, I'm about to put 13 non-English speaking students in your class at one time. And we're going to provide someone to be a translator. But good luck with that in your class that is already overextended. I was like, great. All right, let's do it. But what they didn't tell me was that that class would become the quote unquote English language learners math class. So every week when new students would come in, they would try to squeeze them into that class, even if that meant moving other students out of that class. So I ended up at one point in time with about 16 students who were English language learners in one Algebra 1 class. But the fun part was I got really invested. I went and bought what I thought was going to help. I bought like an English, Spanish, math dictionary, which by the way, completely unhelpful. And then like I had a smart board at the time. And I think nowadays a lot of people have interactive whiteboards, but I had an interactive whiteboard. So I had to learn how to point and shoot and use a lot of imagery in order to show how the math worked. The students were completely invested. Like they wanted to learn the math, but they also wanted to learn English and I wanted to learn Spanish. So we kind of had like a deal where I would learn new Spanish phrases and they would learn new English phrases. So it wasn't that when I wanted to talk to them, I talked to them directly. I didn't use the translator as much in one-to-one conversation. We kind of fought our way through those conversations and we figured it out. They also kind of helped each other along the way. But I was just like, if I'm going to be your math teacher, I'm not going to be afraid of you being in my class. I'm going to use this as an experience to build this bridge that we can absolutely have with math. You know, it's so funny because they say math is a course that it's regardless of language. The kids can just jump in and figure it out. That is not the case. And I knew it wasn't the case because I went to like one of those TQ Texas Instruments conferences. And one of the lecturers there was a professor from Mexico. And I went and sat in his class. It was the most difficult thing I'd ever done. I didn't understand him. He had a translator there with him. I was so lost. And it reminded me of my students. It was that exact same year that I had those students was the same year that I went and sat in that class. And it gave me a deeper foundation, I think, of kind of what they were facing as they were trying to learn and made me really think about my teaching in a way that I wanted us to be able to bridge our divide a little bit better. And I think that just those moments like that. And then also another lesson, a lot of times you'll have other Spanish speaking students in class and teachers would rely on those students to work with the students who didn't speak English. Oh, can you translate for that for them? Can you explain that to them? And couple of my students were like, Miss, we love helping, but we need to learn too, and we need to understand it too. And we don't want to get so caught up in having to do that. And that gave me a moment of pause because number one, it wasn't their job to do. And number two, it was great for them to do, but it also wasn't fair for them to be relied upon to do that. So I took the time to try to learn. I would visit them in other classes, stay behind before school, and really try to help explain and understand. And I think that was probably one of my favorite classes and favorite years just because I felt like I grew so much as a teacher. And I know that those students did very well in class because they learned.
That example is huge in the idea that we're in math classes, but we are really teaching students, like there's the math curriculum is there and we're covering that and we're bringing all the math out in the open, but we have to find a way to reach our students and not to just teach math. I want to touch back on a little bit about what you had said about that student who was getting kicked out of class all the time, because I think they're kind of tied together in the sense that if you're just teaching math and you're not actually thinking about the students in front of you, kids are going to get kicked out because they're like, this is not for me. This is not my place. And maybe some of those students would feel like that too if you had taken that approach in that class of 68 that you said. Because when I think about it, I got into teaching because I was really good at math. And we've talked about this in the podcast lots of times that, I was a memorizer. I was praised for getting really good marks on tests. And I was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to go in. I'm going to go into math. And when I came out into being a teacher, I was so opinionated in the sense that I thought I knew what good math teaching was. And good math teaching was exactly how I was a good math student. I was just going to show everybody how to do stuff. And if you were late, you weren't coming in, no matter what the reason was. And if you were going to be talking out in class, then I was going to take it out on you. Like I spent years teaching in that way. And I had a lot of trouble because I was also teaching groups of students who didn't want to be there. Like most of us all have to teach kids that don't want to be in math class. And I'm thinking back to that student that you said was getting kicked out of class all the time. I used to kick kids out of class, for silly reasons that I think now for a variety of things. And I was just focused on the math and mostly me. I was thinking about like, I want to get the math out in this exact way. And if you're not going to follow along what I'm doing, then it's your fault. See you later. It's been a number of years now that I've changed, but I had this, like what you said, like a moment of pause where I realized that some of these students coming into my room, this might be the only positive experience they have with an adult, all day. And they're coming into class and they're hearing it. If I'm being negative towards them, they're saying, there's that again. Like I'm getting it from this guy too. And so I changed after that moment of pause. I was like, I don't know all the reasons that they're coming in late or they're having trouble, but I'm going to listen. And it was a big change for me. And since then, I've had very, very few classroom management problems because we're teaching kids now, not just the math.
That's a very great learning point to have. I think what really helped me was the experiences that I had growing up, not just myself as a student, but my mother dragging me to the church to tutor these kids who needed to pass the state exam in order to get a high school diploma. At that point in time, I never thought about teaching. I was mad at my mama because I didn't want to go to church and do the math. But to see the looks on their faces when they understood something, that does something to you. Even at 12 or 13 years old, it does something to you. But for my students in my class, because, I taught where I grew up in a pretty low access community. We were kind of racially divided in terms of the communities of where people live for the most part. And we had a high population of Hispanic students, most of them, majority, actually all of them were, not all of them, but majority, either were immigrants themselves or had immigrant family members within their family ecosystem. So we had a lot of kind of growing pains just from trying to get who we were as people, I guess, to the forefront of what we did. But my foundations of teaching have always been in remediation and working with students who didn't understand before, and trying to find all of these other different ways to teach them. And, when you're in that situation, you have no choice but to kind of really be creative. But because I also understood my community, it helped, I think, in connecting with students whose the issues that they had nothing to do with whether or not they could do the math. The student that I followed through high school, he could do math front, left, back, and right in his brain. It was all the other stuff that was taking place in his life, in school and community that was holding him back. I think that's something that I probably adopted a lot more than most people would. But I also understood my community enough to know that I had to.
And that's something that I think we have to learn as we become educators. Like you think back to our pre-service time. We had some pre-service time when I was a student in classrooms, and some of it is in theory, in classrooms, learning from books and professors. But it wasn't until, you're right in it that you learn that what really matters when you're teaching any subject. We just talked about a couple successes there that you shared with us. I'm wondering if there is an area of challenge for you in math class or maybe in your new role. Like, what is an area that is challenging you right now that you might share with us?
I will go back a little bit in time, not a little bit, actually a lot of bit. And my challenge that I am going to share is from my math class. And it was, I guess, when you are heavy into the theory of math and teaching how things work, and you have students who just absolutely, no matter how many ways you teach it, it's just not going to happen. They're not going to get it. They don't care what you have to say. They're not rude or inappropriate. It's nothing like that. They just are not able to wrap their minds around the math, period, in any way, shape, or form. Those moments were, I think, real challenges for me. I had one student that I could look at his paper and know that he didn't understand because he would start drawing. It wasn't just like squigglies and doodling. He had a certain character that he would draw. And so he would fill his paper with that character. When I would see that and glance at his page, I was like, yeah, he has no clue what I'm talking about. And it can be something simple to me, but to him, it just wasn't connecting. I could use manipulatives, I could use technology, I could use videos, I could use other people teaching it. It didn't matter. It just wasn't happening. Those moments, I think, were toughest. And I wasn't always successful. I had some students that were not successful because I did not know how to reach them. Could they have had other issues that kept them from understanding? Quite possibly. But in my mind, it was almost difficult for me to accept that. I immediately took it as my failure as a teacher that I wasn't able to do it. Now, years later, this particular student was actually taking developmental classes. And the developmental classes that he took in college, it was on a automatic program where he would log in online, go through all of the practice sessions, take quizzes and homework to pass. And he actually came to me for tutoring with that, years after he was in my class. So I kind of helped him through it, and I kind of got to see him build on those blocks and actually to find some successes back then. But all the while I was working with him and seeing him finally making those connections, it took me back to my time teaching him And I just kept wondering, like, what could I have done to help you have gotten this back then? I think those moments are always the toughest for me, when you just absolutely cannot get a specific idea across. And that's such a struggle. I think that's something that even translates into what I do now in terms of working with adults with technology. I'm like, I don't understand why is it so hard for you to log into a Google account? It's easy. But I think that those moments kind of helped me kind of working through those issues, that we all come with our own set of structures. We have our own plateaus. We block things out that we just don't want to learn. I am a horrible cook. I can do all kinds of stuff. I can connect all the technology in the house, but if you give me even a cookbook to follow, I'm going to burn it. So it's just kind of
the book or the food or both.
All of it. So I mean, I just hate it. So I just think that I'm starting to make more direct connections like that to the students in my class. That some of it, absolutely, I'm sure, was some type of disability involved. But there were times when it was just, I'm just going to put this mental block up and I'm not even going to try to work around it. I struggle with how we deal with that. And I go back to myself as a cook. I could probably be a good cook if I wanted. I just choose not to.
Right. And I'm listening to this conversation and John's reflection as well on, you can only have your own perspective. Like, I only know what life is like to be me. Like, that's the life that I've been living. And I now realize that I've lived a life of privilege in so many different ways. And, you've mentioned that in your school, where you had a high ELL population, where you had quite a large number of students who were struggling to even acquiring the English language, which is like a hurdle. And then you had also referenced back to the first student that you had kind of followed into high school to be there as a support. We don't know what's going on at home for these students, right? And in their world, like, we haven't the faintest idea of what is actually happening. And something that I really respect of your work is not only are you a huge tech advocate and Edtech advocate, but you also speak a lot about equity and diversity in the classroom. And we're wondering, like, in your opinion, what is diversity and what is not diversity? And why is it so important that every educator really, and I mean, it's one thing to say that you care about equity and diversity, but it's another thing to actually do the hard work of trying to figure it out. So can you help us understand that a little bit more for those who are sitting at home and they've only lived the life that they've lived, and they might be struggling with how can they help ensure that there is equity in their classroom?
So that's a pretty loaded question. So what is diversity and what is not, and equity and what isn't? I think that the best way I can explain it is like this. When I'm in a classroom, forget me in a classroom, let me go into my professional learning spaces. I would like the area from which I learn to mirror the community and world of which I live. So that's a pretty direct and loaded question to that. And I'm going to get to that in a second. So there are certain things like affinity groups. So affinity groups are like, especially for minority in terms of ethnicity, culture, and race and gender, sometimes those affinity like-minded groups are important in terms of building support structures for each other. For example, one of the school districts that I worked in, the high school girls ran a coding club for girls. And so the high school girls would visit elementary and middle school campuses and host these coding clubs just for girls to learn together. And that was kind of my first introduction to that world, because I was like, why do we need to do this? Blah, blah, blah. But once I saw how those girls just were able to blossom and open up and learn in a way that they wouldn't have been able to in a what we would consider a more diverse class, it kind of just solidified for me on what it meant to have those moments of support. So you have to have sometimes those moments of support. But that doesn't mean that it's okay for a person to only be around people who are exactly like them. That shouldn't be the case. I say that shouldn't be the case, but it often is the case, especially when those structures are needed. For example, a community school that is in a predominantly Black neighborhood is going to have predominantly Black students in the classroom. And that's the way it should be within that community structure. And so that's a completely different experience. And I'm trying to find my best way to answer this because this is what I meant by this is a loaded question and it's hard to answer. But in terms of my adult professional learning, I guess in my experience as a coming from tech, I'm used to walking into a room and being like the only Black person in the room. And I'm surrounded by a whole group of very white privileged people who do not, like, are not quite even understanding that, maybe we should have more than one Black person in this room. Where are my Native communities? Where are my Hispanic communities? Where are my Asian community? Like, it's just so mind boggling to me how we've just become okay with that. So that's one kind of major area. When we talk about diversity, and I don't mean just filling it with, oh, we have 3 people of this race. Now we need 3 more of this one and 4 more of this one and 5 more of this one. No, that's not what I mean. I mean that the space needs to be inviting and open to all who need and want to learn. So that's number one. And then in terms of when we're trying to look at expertise within those spaces, we need to look at people for who they are and the expertise for who they are within, I would like to say regardless of race, but because there's just this, I guess, inherent, I don't want to call them blinders of bias. Sometimes it is a person can have not sometimes, it happens often. 2 people can have the exact same qualifications, but 9 times out of 10, the person who is a non-person of color or a white person would be seen more of an expert, especially if it's a white male, than a person of color or a woman. And that has been consistent across the board, not just in Edtech, but across in other fields as well. So I guess the gist of this whole thing is make your rooms as mirroring to the world as you can possibly make them. Invite people of different thoughts, invite people of different backgrounds, ethnicity, cultures, genders, but making sure that everyone has the exact same opportunity to be a part of the learning environment. And I don't even know how else to just kind of tackle such a broad conversation that it almost deserves its own conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really first want to applaud you for handling that question. And really, I feel like I learned a few things there as well. And something that I heard echoed in your message was this idea, and I wish I was trying to Google as we were talking here. I heard in a book somewhere where they described this idea of like empathy being the ability to essentially see the world through the eyes of other people. And I try my best to think about that and try to think of like, I only see the world through my own eyes. And this is for, you had mentioned all kinds of different scenarios here, whether it be race or whether it be sexual orientation or whether it be, all of these different, the diversity, the pieces that make us different. Being able to think about what the world looks like and what the world feels like through somebody else's eyes, I think, is really important. And it's really hard at the same time. And I love how you're just saying about, the number one thing we can do to start is to ensure that the space is inviting and it's ready and it's, really creating that non-threatening classroom environment so that every learner feels welcomed and feels as though this is going to be a very low stress, very high and engaging sort of experience every single day.
Absolutely. And I didn't even talk on sexual identity. And that's an area that we often leave off, but is also equally as important. It's not just our classrooms, it's our school community. Does every person feel like they are part of it? Does every person feel valued? Does every person feel like they have a safe space? So you need safe spaces and you need communal spaces. And we sometimes forget that. And I think that my times, whether it be as a student or even now, as a person connecting with the world outside of education, I feel like I've learned just so much more on what it truly means to be inclusive and to even open my eyes broader than I really had ever had before. Even though I thought my eyes were open broad, they really weren't. I would like to think that now I can take these ideals and somehow embed them into my work in some capacity. That's what I'm trying to do anyway.
As I was just reflecting to myself, I realized something sort of interesting in how we sort of make these assumptions. And you had referenced a scenario where if a white male is going for a position and, there's a person of color, or if it's a female, or if, name the other groups that might be in the mix here, how this sort of issue with the table being tilted in one direction, something that is really difficult is the assumptions we make about people just from our initial perception or what we see. And, I had a scenario where, for example, and this is not nearly as important or deep, but for my son's a pretty big boy and he's in junior kindergarten. And when he's playing with the other kids in our neighborhood, they're a few years older. And because he's so big, he's about the same size as those students or as those kids. And oftentimes he gets treated a little differently because it's like they see his size and they assume that he should know certain things like the older kids know, right? Like what's appropriate and what's not in certain cases. And, I've seen that scenario, and that to me is like such a minor thing. But to me, it just shows that initially, just by jumping to a conclusion initially, that can really, really cause some issues. So we have to be hypersensitive to these things, especially when we're working with our students in the classroom, to try to dig deeper and try to make sure that we understand without making any sorts of assumptions so that we can be as equitable, not equal. We want to be equitable to ensure that we can support everyone in the areas that they need to be supported in most.
I think we could move this conversation and what we're talking about into kind of like the Edtech world too, because I know that there's a lot of inconsistencies in Edtech and in classrooms. And, it seems like a few years ago, like there was, I guess, we're going back more than 5 years ago, like a huge push, for Edtech in classrooms. We were proponents of that. You were proponents of that. There's so many people who are saying like, yes, this is needed. And then, we also had those people out of the woodwork to say how kids can't even handle this. Like, oh man, give a kid a phone or give a kid an iPad in classroom. What are they going to do with it? We heard those things, 5-6 years ago. I'm wondering, in your experience, in your role and what you've experienced where you are compared to where we are, how is it 5 years later? Do you still believe, the state about Edtech in classrooms? Are we better? Are we worse? Are they the same? Are the barriers still there? Like, what are your thoughts on Edtech now versus then?
That's a good question. So
another small question, eh?
Another small question.
I think I asked about 5 questions in there.
Yeah, you did. So I think that we are still not where we need to be by any means at all, especially when you look at the state of Edtech learning. I think the state of Edtech learning is still on the actual tools that we're using. Like when I'm looking at training courses at conferences, and I still see a lot of Chrome apps for teachers, or here's the apps you need to know, blah, blah, blah. It just seems very much so that we're kind of stuck on this micro level. I saw someone tweeting about having Flipgrid fever and yay, Seesaw. And we're going to have a whole training on Google certification level 1 and 2, or Apple. I'll even say that as well. So I think that we're still very much so on the device and app base. I don't think we talk enough about what deeper learning means and how that translates. We don't talk enough about the K-12 school to college to career pipeline of technology. We talk about coding in a sense, but we only talk about as much as we are comfortable talking about. So let's talk robots and doing some block coding and keep it moving. But we don't talk about how that translates into understanding what computer science or computing means, or understanding just some of the networks that we use. Like right now, every time it seems like I log on Twitter, Instagram is down, or Facebook has given away our data, or Twitter is going crazy, and the algorithms that run the tools that we use, and we're logging into these same tools as consumers all the time. Our students are logging into these same tools, and we have yet to make that connection into the classroom, and not in terms of bringing those tools in, like let's get all the kids on Twitter, but in terms of the implications of that. What does that mean when we share these things? How does a guy who buys a beat from someone across the world and has a producer he's never met create something like an Old Town Road that has become like this massive hit for 13 weeks, #1 on Billboard, with zero experience of music creating, his very first time doing it? Like, we don't talk enough about the changes that are happening with technology in the world, because we're really too stuck on just kind of boxing everything into what it looks like in school. And I think for me, that might have been part of why I kind of grew out of maybe what I was doing as much, because in my mind, I would like for us to tackle these issues and see more of that, but schools are not ready to make that leap. And I think that's for me something that I need to explore. For me, what does that mean? How does that look in a school? How do we have these conversations? How do we leverage technology as people instead of just at tech or as a student or as a teacher?
Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree more. Like, I know that it seems like if we're just tossing technology into the equation, oftentimes it does stay at the surface level, right? It becomes just this thing to do. But what is the technology doing for us that is transformational, like something that I couldn't do before? And then also, like you had mentioned, like, what is the implication? And I know for a long time, I was doing like a paperless math class, and there was a lot of really cool things that came from it. But when I do get back into the classroom, I'm definitely going to be looking at that very differently based on my experience over these past 4 years or so since I've been in that scenario. And there's certain things it's amazing for, but then other things that I was doing it to do it. And that definitely isn't what we want to see teachers doing, right? So that's where I think folks like yourself who are in these roles where you can come in and actually help teachers really try to hone in on why, like what's the intentionality of the technology we're using in our classroom? And then also, what are the implications? Like, what do we need to ensure that students are aware of when they're using the technology and talking about their digital footprint and all of the different ramifications that can come from the different things that we could be posting out there in the world?
That's exactly, I think, my mindset and where I am in terms of technology. I am no longer capable of doing just like let's do a Google training. Let's teach me how to use Google Drive. I'm incapable of doing things that people can Google. And I know that's bad coming from being a math teacher with part of the stuff we were teaching were things kids could look up themselves. But nowadays, with where technology is, I want to challenge us to apply those same ideas of learning that we would want our students to do in our classrooms to how we learn as adults. And I want to have real conversation and real learning beyond that. We're talking to people in the business world, in professional environments, the doctor's office, whatever. I want us to really look out to see how technology is progressing and how can we bring those elements to our classroom. It's a little bit hard when you're teaching Algebra 1 or geometry, but at the same time, there are so many different connections that we can make. And I think that we need to kind of make it a point to do that.
Good points for sure. We don't want to keep you too much longer. We only have one more question before we hang up and say goodbye. It's a question about this music band that I see you tweet about all the time, BTS, which I actually never heard of them until I saw you talk about them on Twitter. You seem to love this. And I actually was reading a while ago, again, after I saw some of your tweets, a blog post you wrote about how the band, helped you see and shape your view of education. Do you mind sharing a little bit about, that love of music and the band and how that shaped your view of education for our listeners?
I can. So for me, I've never, as a connected educator, and I actually have a whole nother blog post to write on this. I think I've kind of thought of the title from connected educator to connected BTS stan or some crazy thing like that. But no, I'd never really ventured outside. I've ventured outside of education, but it was in like adult professional connecting. I did a little pop culture tweeting when an award show was on. And that is actually how I found BTS in 2017. They were performing at the American Music Awards, and they trended like in the USA and worldwide, literally for an entire week leading up to that performance, because their fandom are huge. Now, in my mind, I thought fandom, well, these are my students. These are like 13 to 17-year-olds, blah, blah, blah. But that is not the case. These are like young adults. Yeah, there's some teenagers, but majority of the fandom are people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and up, coming from all walks of life, all diversities that you can, if you want to know diversity, you go to a BTS concert. Because it's not what you think. On my roll at the first concert that I went to this year in LA, sitting next to me were two older women that came in together. They were taking pictures and video. On the other side of me was a college student. In front of me were two 15-year-olds, and on the side of them was an 8 and a 10-year-old. Like beside all of them, there's all these big burly men
Wow.
wearing BTS shirts and hats.
You don't see that very often, all of them together.
No, but you do when you go. So
John, you've got a BTS shirt.
I
You're a big burly man.
I will send you both one.
Oh, beauty.
But no, I think that the way that it's really impacted me is it made me, number one, stop kind of judging people or judging what I thought about things before checking it out. And number two is it opened my eyes to this another area that I didn't care about prior to them, which was the inequity of entertainment. I had no idea that the US or even global entertainment was just very much so pro-white English, and everything else was just kind of, yeah, we're just not going to deal with that. But the other part of it was language. In America, we don't learn other languages. Now it's more common that we learn English and Spanish. Well, a lot of our students are. But growing up, we only learned English. Traveling, getting a passport was not something that we did. Whereas when I would travel to other countries, even when I'd go to Canada, everybody in the room was like, oh, yeah, I've had a passport since I was like 10, blah, 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 since I was like 3, and we go everywhere. It's just not something that is a part of our culture and what we do if we don't have the financial means to do it. But connecting within this group or this band, you see these women, young women, older women, families traveling the world to see them, traveling to meet with each other, traveling to learn. Everyone's learning Korean now. Like, I've been studying this language for over a year, and I remember saying, oh, I'm going to be like fluent in a year. And people online was like, yeah, it's not going to happen. And that is true. It does not work that way. But I think for me, it has made me step outside of my comfort zone. And I love their music and I love supporting them. But I've also have enjoyed learning kind of how the world works. Radio is not a listener chosen medium. It's not a democratic system. If you're hearing a song on the radio, it's because that artist's record label has crafted some kind of back-ended deal with whoever the programmer is of the network or of that station, and that's how that music is allowed to play. The top 40 songs across the country are crafted in that way. So smaller bands are often not heard and don't have the opportunity to chart or be heard within that medium because maybe they don't have that same type of backing. It's just really interesting just how the world works when you look outside of kind of the bubble you've placed yourself in. My bubble was education. I tweeted education. I talked education. If I did travel, it was because I was going to an Edtech conference. Now I travel to go to a concert to hear 7 guys singing Korean with, 60,000 other fans. And it is like the greatest moment ever.
Amazing. I love how you made that connection to education, right? How it's about, we have so much to learn from people. It's not about the assumptions or anything like that. When someone walks into the room, we just need to learn more about what they know, what they like. And I love it. That's great. So as I'm looking at the time here, I see that we've been on for quite a while here, and we don't want to take up too much more of your time this evening. Rafranz, where can people find out more about you, the Rafranz Davis, a math Edtech specialist? Go ahead and drop some social profiles, any links, or any other useful ways that people can connect with you before we sign off for the night.
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Rafranz Davis, Rafranz Davis. If you like to hear sometimes the occasional education, political bashing, and a lot of promotion of my favorite Korean boy band, BTS, that's where you can catch me. I'm on LinkedIn. I think if you search my name, you find it. People find me all the time that I don't know where they found me from, but they happen to do that. I mean, that kind of those 2 networks mainly. I blog, so I have my own domain. It's rafranzdavis.com. But I'll be honest, I have not updated my personal blog since 2017. Here is why. I started writing on Medium. I like the flow, how the writing works on Medium. Like, I just think it is such a great experience.
Oh, yeah?
And I kind of hate the way my personal website works. So I've been saying that I'm going to update it for like 2 years, and I haven't done it yet. Now that I have a little bit extra time, I'm probably going to do it. But for now, I blog on Medium and I share the Medium writings on Twitter, or you can look me up on Medium as well.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you for that. We will put all that in the show notes. And I think we've got a couple other videos from some of your keynotes we'll throw in the show notes too. We definitely want to thank you for joining us here on the podcast. This has been an inspiring conversation, not only for Kyle and I, but I know for the listeners who are going to be hearing this. So we definitely want to thank you for that. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We'll talk to you soon. Take care and have a great evening and enjoy the summer.
Bye.
We want to thank Rafranz again for spending some time with us to share her ideas and insights with us and you, the Math Moment Maker community.
September 27th, 2019 is coming up soon for you if you're listening close to when this episode aired. That date is your last chance to register with us for our 16-week full online workshop.
Our workshop's designed to walk you through step-by-step to help you teach through real-world problems and create those resilient problem solvers you're after.
If you're interested in learning more about registering, be sure to check out makemathmoments.com/online workshop. If you're listening after the fall 2019 registration close date, you can still head to makemathmoments.com/online workshop to join the waiting list in order to get notified for your next opportunity to participate.
That's makemathmoments.com/online workshop. We look forward to hanging out with you online and diving into some learning together.
In order to ensure you don't miss out on new episodes as they come out each week of the podcast, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform.
Also, if you're liking what you're hearing, please share the podcast with a colleague and help us reach an even wider audience by leaving us a review on iTunes and tweeting us at MakeMathMoments on Twitter. Show notes and links to resources from this episode can be found at makemathmoments.com/episode 43. Again, that's makemathmoments.com/episode 43.
We release a new episode every Monday morning, so keep an eye out for our next episode.
Well, until next time, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And high fives for you.